Welcome to the Workforce Navigator podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a very special guest on with Dan Bovee. Now, Dan, you are the Director of Talent Acquisition and Development in Morey. You've been in the business and in leadership management roles for over 20 years. You've helped scale businesses. And the one thing that I'm not going to hold against you is you're a big University of Michigan fan. But I have to say, what we're going to talk about today is such an important topic because we all know that high performance teams lead to high performance companies. And we're going to talk about the secret formula that top leaders use to build unstoppable teams and how we should do it. But before we do that, I'd love to just maybe have you spend a minute here and explain a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on, Steve. I appreciate the time here this morning. Yes, originally from Michigan, 20 years, mostly in the staffing business. So I've been a part of big organizations, small organizations, medium-sized, led teams, scaled teams, anywhere from 2 to 3 folks, all the way up through 180 people. So spent the last couple of decades in leadership and professional development. So really glad to be on the podcast today.
I'm going to just kind of start right in. And you had a really interesting philosophy. You call it the 2 pillars of sustainable organizational growth. And I'd love to just hear what those 2 pillars are. And then we'll talk about how we build those pillars and why they're so important.
Yeah, for sure. So part of this comes from the Jim Collins book, Good to Great. Most people have read it at this point. But if you haven't, succinctly, what he comes up with is in order to build a successful team or a high-performing team, you got to have the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats on the bus. So we kind of think about that in terms of how we organize. So looking at who are the right people, I think those are folks who uphold common core values, share the vision of the organization, and have a passion for what they're doing. So who are the wrong people? Probably don't exhibit the core values, cause drama within their respective team, usually come to individuals with problems without solutions, talk bad about the company to their peers, never approach leadership, all that stuff. And then the right seats. So I think putting people in the right seats creates the opportunity for folks to lean into their strengths and get the results ultimately that they want. It allows them to be more productive, creative, and engaged. And I think it's incumbent upon us as leaders to really pay attention to our people and understand what they're good at and try to put them in the best possible position to be successful. So that's kind of where that starts. And I think what you're talking about, Steve, our discussion last week, we talked about challenging, but also encouraging our people at the same time and really how to balance that tension to make people successful once you've got the right folks in the right seats. And I think that's where you're going with that one.
And you've been in talent acquisition for so long, getting the right people into the right seats seems like a very easy phrase to say, not a very easy thing to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I mean, you have to pay attention to your people. You have to understand them, who they are, what they're good at in order to be able to set them up for success. So I'll give you an example. There was a company I worked at. We had a person who was in customer success, and we noticed that every time that she had a client interaction, she automatically just started selling to them. She would ask really good discovery questions, identify pain, quantify that pain. And really that was her natural talk track. So after we observed this behavior for a couple of months, we pulled her aside and we said, "Hey, have you ever thought about being in sales?" And she said to us, no, I couldn't be in sales. I'm not a salesperson. And we're like, "You're already doing it." I don't know if you noticed, but you're already doing the heavy lifting of the sales role. So we put her in that position. She was a little bit hesitant at first, but after a couple of months, getting her feet wet, she got super comfortable. And then inside of a year, she was one of the top salespeople in the entire region. So that's just an example of, as a leader, if you pay attention to your folks and you ask good questions to them and understand who they are and where they're comfortable, you can make an impact on their professional career if you put them into the right spot.
And how do you, from a talent acquisition basis, you're interviewing people all the time. You're working with hiring managers, you're understanding what's your philosophy on getting the right people in and how you're screening and how you're interviewing and how you ascertain up front.
Yeah, it's important. I kind of look at it, there's 2 sides to the same coin. I think the one side is, do they have the skills and experience to do the job? That's the easy part of recruiting is, do they check the boxes here? Can they actually bring the skill set that we need to this position. I think the thing that's more challenging is understanding whether or not they are a cultural fit for us. Are they going to be able to come in here and share our core values and further the mission and have passion for what they're doing? A lot of times when I'm talking to people, Steve, I'm really asking a lot of behavioral questions, trying to understand situations that they've been in, how they've reacted to those. TED-W is an acronym that I use a lot, which is tell me about, explain, walk me through, describe. And I think it's always kind of in my mind when I'm going through that. I want to understand the situations that this individual has been put in, how they've reacted, what their thought process is in the moment, and then try to understand how well that kind of fits in with what we do here at Morey and whether or not they would be a cultural fit based on that.
Now, the word culture has been used so often, so widely. It's everything from a page on the website, a plaque on the wall, right? Why is culture so important in your mind? You brought it up as one of the number one things.
Yeah. I think that it's important to have folks who are striving toward a common goal, but doing it with the same guiding principles. So the culture to me is the way that you treat yourself. It's the way that you treat other individuals internally. It's the way that you treat folks externally, how you conduct yourself within a professional context. And I think that if you have folks who are striving toward the same objective in the same way, it makes things a lot more cohesive and it really galvanizes the team. If you know that the folks that you're working with assign value to the same things that you assign value to, then it really motivates you to work even harder.
I even interviewed people like C-suite individuals, and everybody's interviewing us as much as we're interviewing them. And they're saying if they don't feel it's the right cultural fit, they don't want to come either. And that's different. Over the decades you've been doing this, when did culture start to become such an important competitive advantage for actually acquiring the right talent? The whole thing started out by like, how do we get the right people, unstoppable teams into the right seats? And now these people are interviewing us, they're screening us, and they're saying culture is really important to them. We're saying culture is important. When did this phenomenon happen?
For me personally, well, I'll give credit to my first employer. So I started with Aerotech, which is part of Allegis Group. It's a massive staffing company. They had and still have, I believe, a really good training program. And they talk about culture a lot and how important that is to perpetuate the culture, to pass that on to the next generation of new employees, of recruiters, and to uphold the standards that the organization has. And so for me, just going through that experience, it was apparent to me that if you built a strong culture, it could be a competitive advantage for you. And that was evident. I think with that particular position, it was folks having each other's back. That was a big thing is if you succeed, we all succeed. If you fail, we all fail. That's kind of how they treated it. And then the other thing was just work your tail off. Simple as it sounds. That was one of the core values there. It was look out for each other. If you have an opportunity to make Steve successful, bring him with you and work your butt off. And that was evident to me that it differentiated that particular organization at that time from some of the other competitors that we have in the market.
Just to kind of accentuate your point, there was a study that was done in 2023 by McKinsey, and they looked at over 400 highly profitable companies, B2C companies, B2B companies, and they determined that the number one differentiator in the market was customer experience. Now, customer experience is directly tied to employee engagement. It's the people that create the experience. So when you said what triggered that in my mind is when you started talking about culture as a competitive advantage. And you have a framework that you alluded to a little bit earlier, which is like this challenge, encourage culture framework. Because cultures, they happen with or without us. There is going to be a culture, but how we steer that culture is going to be a major competitive advantage for how we bring on the right people, then turn into a competitive advantage of how we compete in the marketplace. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about your challenge, encourage culture framework.
Yeah, for sure. To go back to your point, Steve, I think that makes a lot of sense with me. That tracks with my experience. I think it was Richard Branson who said, take care of the people, they'll take care of the customers. I also hear things like happy people make happy people. Same kind of deal. If your employees are engaged and they feel empowered and encouraged and challenged, they're going to pass that on, that attitude, that disposition to your customers, and your customers are going to feel it. That type of stuff is contagious. There's no question about it. But in terms of the framework, the challenge and encourage framework that we talked about, I think successful cultures have both. You have to be able to challenge your folks to get outside their comfort zone and to stretch and to develop themselves from a professional perspective, but you also have to encourage them at the same time. If you think about challenging people without encouragement, that creates probably a culture where folks feel constantly like they're failing. They're trying new things and they're just falling down all the time, and there's nobody there to help them, to pick them up, to encourage them to get back on the horse, so to speak. If you take the challenge away and then all you do is encourage your folks, then you have probably a culture of complacency where nobody's really stepping outside their comfort zone or trying to accomplish anything that they feel is a challenge. So in my opinion, in my experience, you've got to have both of those things. The analogy that comes to mind right now is you have kids, Steve, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I got some too. So I think about teaching my kids how to ride a bike, honestly. If you want a mental picture of what that looks like in terms of challenging people and encouraging them, that's what it looks like. When you're holding on to that seat and you're helping them do something that they're uncomfortable with for the first time, but then eventually you got to let that seat go and you got to cheer them along and hope that they make it. A lot of times they don't and they fall down, and you got to run over there and pick it back up and tell them, hey, look, you almost did it. You're going to do it next time. It's okay. Let's try again. I'm behind you. I got your back. That's the way I think about it. And I think that's successful cultures or successful leaders are able to both challenge and encourage their people at the same time.
And part of that challenge, encourage kind of framework is like your analogy on the bike. We know our kids are going to fail. We know they're going to stumble. We know they're going to fall, but we want to encourage them to get out and try, knowing they're going to fail, knowing that's an important part of the learning process, and ultimately being successful. So does that part of the model come into the challenge, like encouraging people to try and fail as well, and acknowledging that that's a part of business and succeeding?
Yeah, I think it is for sure. I don't know if you're familiar with, so Google did a study, it's called Project Aristotle. It was an internal study, and they basically tried to figure out why some of their teams were so much higher performing than some of the others in the organization. And what they came back with is interesting. They said the number one factor that determined that was psychological safety. And I love that phrase, psychological safety. So what does that mean? It means that employees feel comfortable to take intelligent risks, to step outside of their comfort zone and not be afraid to make mistakes, as long as their mistakes are in an effort to develop themselves or the team. I think that's kind of what you're talking about, is setting up that framework and the understanding to say, we want you to do that. Sometimes it's not going to work out, but at the same time, eventually you will break through and eventually you will have a skill set that you didn't have before. It's kind of cliche, but it's like lifting weights. Your muscles will atrophy if you don't lift, but if you lift every day, you'll get really strong. It's the same kind of deal. Like, we're going to encourage our folks to lift in this particular area, whether it be public speaking, contract negotiations, whatever. But the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And eventually you'll be able to hone that skill set, as long as you have a leader who is encouraging you along the way and sympathetic to the fact that we're going to fall off the bike a few times, and that's okay.
So you mentioned the importance of the leader, leadership in total inside of the organization. What's their role in helping to create and perpetuate this kind of a culture that you're talking about?
Yeah. Ooh, that is a big one. I think that first and foremost, whatever culture you're trying to nurture or perpetuate, you have to embody that first. You can say whatever you want to, but if you're not trying the best that you can to uphold the things that you're saying, then your employees probably aren't going to do that either. And I think the other thing is, and this is a mistake that a lot of new leaders make, I think, is leaders don't always have the answers. I think what folks are looking for is authenticity from their leadership. You're not always going to have the answer. It's okay to say that. I mean, I can't count the number of times that I've got my team in a room and said, hey guys, here's the problem. I don't know how to solve this. I'm not really sure how to go forward. Can we brainstorm this thing and just try to figure it out together? So I think the vulnerability, the collaboration, trying to embody to the best of your ability the things that you say are important. And I think the other thing is eventually as a leader, the rubber is going to hit the road and you're going to have to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. I think of a situation we had somebody who was a very high performer, was a pain in the butt to work with. Nobody really wanted to be around this guy, if I'm honest. Didn't really uphold the core values of the organization. And as a leader, that is your inflection point right there. That's the point where you're challenged to say, okay, do you really believe this? Or is this just words on a paper or something we put on a mouse pad? Or are we actually going to walk the talk here? So I think it's really important to come through in those moments to let your people know that, hey, this is not just something we talk about. This is something that we are committed to. And we want to make sure that everybody is aligned in terms of trying to live those guiding principles or those core values to create the best culture possible.
And you used in a past conversation, you emphasize trust and in building trust. And how does everything that you're talking about here creates trust in that if the leaders are the role models of the culture themselves, you can trust in it, you can rely on it. It becomes a differentiator for where you want to work and how you work and all the things that we've been talking about here. So I just wanted to say that there's a strategy that has to be in place. Who owns the culture? Who owns the strategy? Who owns managing it? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that we're fostering our culture correctly?
Well, I think it looks different within different organizations, depending on how big they are, how they're structured. I've always been a firm believer, and this is my experience, that culture comes from the top down. It does not come from the bottom up. It has to be communicated clearly and perpetuated from the highest levels of the organization, and then have everybody aligned underneath those individuals. If you think about an organization where you may have folks all the way up to the director or VP level being very good stewards of the culture, but certain folks within the C level feel like that doesn't apply to them for whatever reason, then everything rings hollow that the other people do. So that would be my answer, is the very, very top levels of the organization is where that culture should come from.
So when a culture is working right, it's embodied by the organization. You talked about how it can cut through chaos, like organizational chaos. Obviously, we don't want organizational chaos. So what I'm wondering is, how do you see the culture kind of helping us avoid that organizational chaos?
Well, I think that if you have a strong culture and folks are aligned around a organizational objective, we can talk about that a little bit too. The ideal situation is that these individuals will check each other. Meaning, if I'm in the room with my whole team and there's a discussion happening, or if I'm not in the room and there's a discussion happening, ideally that discussion looks the same regardless of whether I'm there or not. In the highest performing teams that I've been a part of, you have folks holding each other accountable and challenging each other to do the best they can on a daily basis. And that's where I think the magic starts to come in, is when you have people who are closely aligned around a shared objective, they're holding each other accountable to doing the best that they can to hitting that objective. I think that's when things can really start to fly.
We talk about high performance teams, and a culture helps people work together as teams and not independent silos. And because it helps the culture to be supportive and lift others up and respectful. So that makes perfect sense. How do we, if we're talking to the C suite and they're the ones that are setting the role model, they have objectives, they have KPIs. Does this have a direct line of sight to their language? When they go into the board meeting, nobody on the board is saying, how is the culture coming? Are you guys being a good role model? Nobody talks about this. So Tell me, how do we talk about this with our C-suite? How does it align with the goals, the vision, the KPIs, the objectives, the measurable objectives that they have that they're focused on?
I think culture feeds everything, honestly. And the purpose of it is to build a high performing team that ultimately is going to consistently hit their objectives. And I think what you're talking about, Steve, you're absolutely correct. When you're dealing with the C suite, they want to know, did we or did we not get this done? Are we on track or are we not to getting this done? And I think the way I think about it is that culture is the engine that propels that vehicle to consistently produce quality results. And so that's the end goal, or that's the fruit of the tree, is that, hey, we're consistently growing, we're hitting our objectives. But really, the roots of it and the branches are the culture that you've built and put in place.
There's a reason why I asked that beyond making that direct connection, but most of us in HR and talent acquisition, we're treated more like a support department than we have a seat at the table. But we're the ones that are most interested in fostering a company culture that attracts and retains the right people. Going back to the Jim Collins book, getting the right people in the right seats. That is not an easy task. And it does, just like with the psychological safety and the Google internal analysis that they did, this makes a big difference. This actually creates high performance teams. Now, you talk high performance teams to the CEO or the CRO, or you're going to get, yeah, they're going to listen. Now they're listening. So I think some of the things that you've talked about here and bringing in outside proof points that say these are the kind of things we do and need to do because we know it impacts performance of the teams and it impacts performance of the business. And it doesn't have to be our opinion. And if we bring it to them, guess what? We help them foster and create and then bring in the right people and retain the right people. Retention and direct impact on the business is well documented, well known, costs and ramp up times and everything. So we can look at both sides of retention, but acquisition of the right teams. We can talk their language. And I think that's one of the big takeaways that I had from our earlier conversation is that it's something that we need to know their language of how they talk and how they think. And how do we help them set the tone for the culture so that we could have all the benefits we've been talking about here? Is that a good takeaway from our conversation here?
Yeah, I think so. Ultimately, strong cultures produce strong results, which is, again, we kind of said that, but when you get to the C level and you get into the boardroom, results are what matters most to these individuals, and rightly so. So that will resonate if you explain to people, look, this is a result of us codifying and building a strong culture over time, which turns into a high performing organization, which makes everybody in the boardroom look good.
We've talked about so much. For all the HR talent professionals, leaders that are listening here, if there was one thing that you wanted them to remember from our conversation, one important takeaway, what would that be?
Well, I think from a leadership perspective, if I can take it that route just for a second, we talked a lot about trust in challenging and encouraging and building a good culture and all this stuff. I just want to mention that I think compassionate management is so important. I think it's key to a lot of the things that we're talking about is to have the ability to manage compassionately with your folks, which will help build trust and a lot of the things that we talked about. But that's the ability to put yourself in other people's shoes, to see the world through their lens, to empathize with them, but leave enough space to be able to alleviate suffering or solve problems on their behalf. I think it's so key. And it's something that I didn't learn until I was probably about 12 years into my career. And when I really put my mind to trying to be a compassionate leader, it made a very large impact. I think earlier in my career, I was more of a driver, leaving that space to understand your people and where they're coming from. Here would be an example. So say you have an employee who every Monday they come in late. Supposed to start at 8 o'clock. They're coming in at 8:10, 8:15. Okay, well, you want to sidebar with that person and figure out what's going on. Fix the problem. That's the objective. We got to fix the problem. This guy's coming in late every Monday. Well, there's a couple ways to approach that. I think in my earlier days, I probably would have just sat down with that individual and say, hey, I noticed every Monday you're coming in anywhere between 8:10 and 8:15. Our expectation is that you get here at 8 o'clock. So I need you to start doing that. Okay. That's the conversation. Nowadays, I think I would approach it very differently. And I would say, hey, I've been noticing that you're coming in Mondays late 10 or 15 minutes. Can you tell me why that's happening? What's going on with that? And maybe they have a good reason. Maybe their mom is losing her eyesight and she needs a ride to her standing appointment at the eye doctor every Monday morning. And they're trying their best to get there at 8 o'clock, but they just can't make it. That's a very different conversation. You have somebody who is trying their best to take care of their family, get to work on time. The intention is there. They're just not approaching it in a way that's working. So that leaves room for a discussion, right? How can we kind of work together to help to solve this issue and alleviate that problem? So I think it's so important to give folks that space and to be empathetic and compassionate to them and understand where it is they're coming from first, to not make assumptions until you really get a feel for the entire scope of what's happening before you kind of jump in and try to do anything about it.
Well, I think that's a wonderful takeaway because you talked earlier about empathy. And if we approach every conversation, interaction, engagement with each other, and we don't look at it as a punitive opportunity, but an opportunity to display empathy, that's an important part of the culture. I would love to, because I know what's going to happen is people are going to have questions. I would love to share the link to your LinkedIn profile so people could reach out and ask questions if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Fantastic. Well, the mission of this podcast is to bring different perspectives, different insights from all of our unique experiences we've all had, and we can share it. And if we can share that, then that's the rising tide that lifts all boats. So I just wanted to say thank you. You've been a very important part of that rising tide today.
Oh, yes, sir. I appreciate the time, Steve. It was great talking to you.